Hi YouTubers, this is Gil. So on this video, I'm gonna talk about how temporary agency jobs differ today compared to 1990, in particular, like from the time when I worked in those things in those kind of places back in 1990, 30 years ago today, and versus today. Like I'm currently working in one of these temporary agency jobs, like these what do you call, like staffing services for these warehouse distribution center jobs. I was working in 1990 and I'm working today in those things right now. In those type of jobs right now. So I could tell you some differences on how they differ. Well, like the nature of the work is pretty much the same. You're loading trucks or you're putting boxes on the pallets and everything like that, and you're doing physical work. It's the same thing. Everything's pretty much the same thing on that aspect. But now, if I'm going to point out a few differences on what's the first thing that you would notice if you were going to go back in time to 1990 working these agency jobs, these temporary starter jobs. Like most of us will be doing these as teenagers when we barely start working, and that's typically our first jobs. But of course, everybody will go in there too. When situations arise, like in my case. But anyway, so the first thing you'll notice that's different in 1990 versus today, 2020, like if you were gonna go back in time, if I was gonna give you a ride to 1990 in my time machine videos, the first thing you'll notice in those jobs when you walk into those jobs is you're not gonna be plagued with any cell phone rules in these warehouses, because back then, where we didn't have any such things back then, there were no cell phones or nothing that we were able to bring into the job that can interfere us from working. But in today's times now, in today's jobs, like you're gonna be plagued with cell phone rules. You're not allowed to bring in a cell phone. Now, they're gonna plague you with that in 2020. So versus back then versus today is cell phone rules. Today you're plagued with cell phone rules, and you'll get in trouble. They can sometimes bitch at you. Like some jobs, some companies will really bitch at you about the cell phone use while you're working. It's only for your breaks and everything. But back in 1990, there's no such thing. Now you're not gonna see anything like that because we didn't have cell phones back then, so. And number two difference, back in my day, the number two difference that we would notice, so like in 1990, the economy was not as good for me. Well, this is just in the case of me and the economy, like the economy and me in my days. But the economy back then was not as strong, or the jobs, was not as plentiful back in my day. But you probably figure because there was fewer people living in California back then, back in the day. So I would guess that there was fewer jobs and there was fewer businesses out. I guess I cannot say for sure, but just basing it on my experience, or basing it on me on what I gone through and everything, it's just basically basing it on me that in 1990, when I started working in these distribution center jobs, so back then, what do we call it? 8 hours back then was how we call it. It was unheard of. It was unheard of back in 1990 anyway, or like especially during the 80s decade. Like 1990 and beyond, especially 30 years ago from 2020 anyway. 8 hours, it was unheard of to work more than 8 hours back then, back in the day. And I tell you, I mean, I never actually really heard of anyone who had regular days more than 8 hours long, except for executives, or except for like managers. Well, yeah, managers and everything, yes. But if it's for employees like me, like regular employees, it was unheard of to hear anyone working more than 8 hours in a day, or getting regular days more than 8 hours long. And another thing too, another part of this is that you were lucky back in the day to get 40 hours a week back in the day, because it was never really enough work. I mean, it was just not enough work to get 40 hours. You were lucky. You were considered lucky to be a temporary, or to have a job working 40 hours, like to get 40 hours. Like some people, apparently some people had them, but I think, like the people, like, I mean, that were there for a while, or they finally gained priority, or whatever they call that. But anyway, I mean, you were lucky. You were considered back then lucky to get 40 hours, because in my days, when I was working in the distribution center jobs, temporary agency jobs, I was like, I mean, the typical days, the typical amount of hours that I used to get was maybe 3 days a week, 8 hours at the most. I mean, that was kind of like at the most that I used to. And then occasionally, I used to work 40 hours. Occasionally, I got 40 hours, but I never, ever got more than that, though. Never in my life. Or never in my life during the 90s decade, or like back in the 80s anyway, in the 80s decade especially. Well, I've never got more than 40 hours, particularly in the 80s decade, or in 1990, because 1990 was the only year that I actually worked in these distribution center jobs. But anyway, I never gotten more than 40 hours back then. But I mean, in those days, like for people who are barely brand new in a job, and they go to these agencies to have an agency find them a job, like I had to back in the day when I had a hard time getting a job on my own. I mean, for these agency jobs, so the typical hours that I worked was maybe 3 days, 8 hours a day, and sometimes, a lot of times, it was less than 8 hours. It was pretty typical to have a job working less than 8 hours, or these temporary. And for me back then, I mean, I used to be called in like to work for 1 day here, and then they would be done with me, and then I would call in available every day, and I would work 1 day in another place. Then they would be done with me, and then I would call in available every day, pretty much every day. I used to call in available, like, because these jobs only lasted a day. Typically, it lasted a day. 1 day, or maybe 2 or 3 days. Sometimes they would last a few days, and then they would be done with me, and then I wouldn't hear of them again, because I would just be hopping to more temporary places, and they would call me up. Or, I mean, they never used to actually call me up. I mean, I used to have to call in available every day for these jobs. And so that was back then, and if I didn't call in available, and they would not call me up to come in to work at all. They wouldn't call me up. Now, if you're gonna ask me, how is it different? How is today, 2020, different from back then that I'm talking about? Well, in today's times, the 8 hours that I was talking about right now, you're lucky to get, now in today's times, you're lucky to get less than 8 hours a day over here, because in every one of these jobs, every job that I've been working here lately in the last year or so through these temporary agencies, I mean, it's like, it's always going to be 10 hours or 12-hour shifts. It's 10-hour and 12-hour shifts is very common in today's times. And so I mean, you'd be lucky to get 8 hours these days. Be lucky to work less than 10 hours these days, you know, and today, well, this is based on me, you know, because it seems like these companies have high demand these days. I mean, it's just a lot of work, or I mean, it's just higher demand for like regular employees, you know, these days. Because there's more places like that being built around the area. I mean, like, there's more people living here, and so more of those places are being built, and there's more jobs now these days than how many people would be willing to work there, you know. Well, anyway, I mean, I just know in today's times, it's like they seem to work you a little bit more harder than back then. But I mean, I just know that 10-hour and 12-hour shifts is very common in today's time. But back in the 90s, back in 1990, it was unheard of to hear of anyone working over 8 hours, you know. But in today's times, you'd be lucky to get to work less than 10 hours. Yeah, in today's times, you know. And then the other part of this that's in today's times, about how many hours you work today. I mean, in today's times, you'd be lucky to get less than 40 hours. It's the other way around, you know. Back then, in 1990, based on my experience, or based on me, anyway, it's just me only. I mean, back then, it was a challenge to get 40 hours. I mean, we would have killed to get 40 hours. I wanted 40 hours. I would have loved to get 40 hours back then because it's more money, you know. You figure it's more money, you know, yeah. But now in today's times, I can't even I don't even have much time at home because I'm working never less than 40 hours these days, you know. Of course, we get some weeks where we get less than that, but it's not common in my job anyway, at least in my job right now. But in all of these jobs, I mean, it's like these, a distribution center job, like a typical, like when we call in available, it's not even really something that we do much anymore, calling in available, because they actually just call you up, because I guess the demand is pretty high for workers, you know, for distribution center workers, you know, like, so, you know, and these jobs, and the other part that's different too, is that I call in available, I called in available, and then they would set me up with work, and then that job, it would stay. I mean, it would stay. I would stay in that job. It would not end. It would not end like the way the back then did. I mean, the work would not last one day or two. It would last for weeks or months. I mean, in the case of one of my last jobs, this job lasted more than a year as a temporary, you know. Like, back then, you would be lucky to get, like, maybe a month. Back in 1990, you would be lucky if you would get a job that would last a month, like, straight, you know. But for me, the longest time in 1990 that I was able to hold on to that temporary job was 2 weeks straight. And then it stopped, you know. But in today's times, though, every time that I call in available, the jobs will last for, like, more than 6 months. And then they're done with me, you know. But during those times, in today's times, we're working a lot more hours than back then, you know. We're working a lot more hours, and in today's times, well, in my current job, I would be lucky to get less than 10 hours, you know, these days, you know, in my current job, and then I would be lucky to get less than 40 hours, you know, because some of us actually had a complaint about working too many hours because, like, we want to spend more time at home and stuff. But for me, I'm okay with it for now. I mean, but even me, of course, you know, like, after a while, if we're working so many hours a week, you know, we might eventually start to complain, or we might eventually start to get tired from it, you know. Like, well, it's more like because we want to have more time at home. But in the case of my job, you know, I've been working a lot of hours, you know, like I've been working like maybe 5 days a week, and sometimes 6 in the last maybe month now. I mean, but I've been working like like typically 5 days a week for like 10 hours a day and everything. But sometimes I get, like I work a half a day on Friday. But anyway, I mean, in today's times, it's like we're working more hours in today's distribution center jobs compared to what it was like in 1990, you know. So, okay, now let's talk about another major difference that's between the distribution center jobs from 1990 and today in 2020. Well, you probably might already know what the other obvious difference. It's the pay. The pay is a major difference back then, because back then in 1990 we were getting paid $5 an hour. I mean, that was the minimum wage. Well, no, that was not the minimum wage. The minimum wage was $4.25 an hour in 1990, and these distribution center jobs had always been known to, or these temporary agency jobs, these distribution center jobs have always been known to pay a little bit more than the minimum wage, because, you know, it's the nature of the work. It's hard work, you know, it's physical work. It's very physical, these jobs. My job right now in 2020 is very physical. But anyway, $5 an hour was what I was getting paid in 1990. So, I mean, if I got full time, I would bring home like maybe like 175, if I remember, but the typical pay that I used to get for like 3 days or 2 days was around $100. You know, I used to bring home like $100 back in the day. You know, that was my typical pay, $100 or up, but rarely I got 40 hours. So I mean the typical pay was $100 back then. So that was 1990. Now in today's time, 2020, the minimum wage had just gone up $1 to $13 an hour right now. And so right now, that's what I'm making right now, $13 an hour. And apparently that's the most money I ever made in my entire life per hour. But anyway, the minimum wage has now gone up to $13 an hour, so that's a huge difference. That's almost like almost three times as much as I was making back then. And on top of that, working like double the hours. Imagine this, you know. Back then, we were lucky to get 40 hours in 1990. At $5 an hour, but in today's times, we'd be lucky to get less than 40 hours making $13 an hour. Yeah, imagine that. Can you imagine the difference? So, talking about the difference, so back then, I would bring home about $100 typically, and then in today's times, making $13 an hour, I just received a check. Like for 40 hours, I got 40 hours. I just happened to get 40 hours last week. And so for a 40-hour check, I received almost $500 for the week. So imagine, look at the huge difference. And so now we're talking about like how the financial life looked like after we would come home from our jobs in 1990 and versus 2020. So you figured, well, like to give you a quick and easy example, my wish list in 1990, I wanted a new camcorder to upgrade my current one with the latest model, but I needed to save $1,000, and I was only bringing home $5 an hour and bringing home $100 a week, you know, so it was going to be pretty challenging to save $1,000 making $5 an hour in 1990. But that was for a camcorder. But I mean, I never did. I ended up never doing it. But I just kept my CPR 250 VHS. And other things that were on my wish list was maybe like buying my own TV and my own VCR back in the day. And back then, a VCR was $300 for a nice one, and that was in 1990, making $5 an hour. So, and then my own TV, my own color TV, like maybe a little 13-inch one would have been nice for my room or something. something like that would cost about $200, making $5 an hour. So it would have been pretty much a challenge to save up for those items. So I ended up not getting them because I was not able to save the money. But I mean, if you're talking about a teenager who's not conservative like me, or if you're just talking about a typical teenager back in 1990, like they would probably buy beer or they would probably buy clothes, you know. And speaking of clothes, I do know some clothes were cheaper back then. Like for an example, a name brand shirt, you'd probably able to buy those for like $20 or something like that. And a name brand pair of pants was probably $20 also. And shoes, well, I do know that's some. And I know like name brand shoes were like $50 back then. I remember LA Gear. I mean, they used to typically be $50 or something for a name brand. But now, if we're talking about today's times, in my days today, for me, if I wanted to buy the exact same thing, but in 2020's models, or in 2020, like everything being in 2020, if I wanted to buy like that same video camera, although I mean it would be like let's say that I was wanting a video camera, like just any video camera, well, chances are we already have one on our phones, you know, we have one, so I probably wouldn't even need to buy one, you know, I probably wouldn't even need to. That would not even be on my wish list because we already have them. Everybody has one these days, you know, so that wouldn't even be on my wish list. So, and then, you know, if we're talking about like that same VCR and same TV, well, I mean, VCRs, who uses VCRs today, you know? we have Netflix and all that stuff. Like, well, anyway, but now when we're talking about a TV, if I wanted to save up to buy a TV, I would be able to buy a TV practically on just the first day I work in my job, you know, like to buy a TV, like to buy something pretty decent, you know, pretty nice one. Like these days, what's a nice TV these days? Like well, I know, like say a 50-inch TV, or like say a TV for your room. You know, typical one is gonna be what, 40-inch or something. Shit, something really nice. 40-inch TV would probably be not even $200 to buy in today's time. And look, if I got paid $500, and I can already buy it on the first week. But back in 1990, if I wanted to buy the little 13-inch TV for my room, I would have had to save for like 2 or 3 weeks working 40 hours. Or, well, I would have had to work a full 40-hour week to get that TV. Or I would have to save for like 2 weeks to get this $200 TV, like the same price, but being a little 13-inch tube TV, you know. But if we're gonna be talking about like how life would look in general, like financial life in general would look, like you picture this, you know, you'd come home like as a typical employee who had just come home from working in these starter jobs. You get like $100 a week, 150 at the most, and then you know, you go home and like you're gonna like you buy your food. It's like the food is about the same, you know. I mean, food was a little bit cheaper back then, you know. I know like Burger King, or if you go out like to fast food, the fast food was cheaper back then apparently, you know. Like I do remember that we used to buy like a meal at Burger King for like $3 for a cheeseburger and french fry and a soda, you know. It was typical back then, you know. And then we would be able to buy, I mean, I think food was a little cheaper back then, and then of course gasoline for your car, you know, like it was $1 a gallon. So you would come home from work on these $5 an hour jobs, and then you need to put gas in your car, so it's $1 a gallon, so you could fill up your tank with $10 out of your $100 check. So okay, that's cool. I mean, but in today's times though, I mean, like everything is a little bit more expensive in today's times, you know, like the food is a little bit more expensive. Well, like if we wanted to go out to the same out like restaurant, McDonald's or Burger King. Well, a cheeseburger and a French fry and a Coke will be about $5 at Burger King now. And then, well, some of these places offer good deals, you know, like, but I mean, anyway, I mean, food is a little bit more expensive today, apparently, but I mean, it's not that much of a big difference, though. But gasoline, however, over here in California, I would come home with a $500 check after working 40 hours, or if I was, well, I mean, we won't get less than 40 hours these days, but anyway, I come home with a $500 check, like $475 or $450 or whatever, on a 40-hour check, and I need to put gas in my car, I mean, in my Kia, and so, I mean, even at $3.50 a gallon, it's gonna cost me about $35 to fill up my Kia, and that's out of my $450 check, and I'm still gonna have $400 left, you know. But now, of course, one of the biggest differences in today's financial life is housing and rent. Rent and housing is a huge difference. Today is a huge, I mean, it's a big challenge in today's times in California anyway, to have a house, to find a place to live in, like where it's affordable, anymore. It's an issue in today's times, no matter what job we have, you know, no matter what job we have, it's an issue to everybody, you know, like in today's times. But back in the 80s, you know, or 1990 anyway, I mean, rent was a lot cheaper. We were able to find an apartment for like $400, you know, like if you wanted to go cheap, you could get an apartment for like maybe $300 back in 1990, you know, maybe like $300 for like a one-bedroom apartment or something back in the day. What happened? I wish we could go back to those days, you know. I mean, I remember hearing of some people paying like $300 for like a studio or something in 1990. So even these less than 40-hour week distribution center jobs back in 1990 would be able to afford that, you know, almost. Anyway, of course, you know, like, but well, in 1992. We were renting an apartment between my brother and me and my other brother. We were paying $550 a month in Corona, California, with a 2-bedroom, 2-bath. No, it was only 1 bathroom. It was 2-bedroom apartment for $550 a month. But, you know, I tell you, I mean, it's a huge difference. But now that same apartment is going to be like, what, $1,500 a month now in today's time? So there you have it. I mean, so if I was gonna say, I mean, what do I think about all this? Well, I mean, it's a huge difference, man. Like the pay is a huge difference today compared to back then, and you know, the nature of work, and I mean how things are. I mean, it's like there's more people living here in California, and so like there's more jobs. The economy is pretty strong right now, at least from what I see. Of course, I'm sure some people are having a hard time getting a job, but I mean, it's not that hard to get a job these days. So I mean, for me, I mean, well, anyway, so there you have it. I mean, so I hope you liked this video, and I hope I didn't bore you now. All right.